Newrelic is a 360-degree observability solution. So what does that mean? That means we are able to see the health of an application from the user experience in their browser and mobile devices all the way through all the back-end systems, including infrastructure and logging. We do this by collecting three types of data: log, metrics, and traces. Newrelic offers a fourth data type called an event, which is kind of like a metric on steroids. An example of that would be if I was having a slow response time, but I didn't, normally a metric will just say that that response time was slow. But with an event, I can say, where did that request come from? Maybe it was from India, maybe it was from somewhere in Europe, and that's why it took long. So the events add additional data to metric type data. We also bring to the table a single data source, which allows us to display the data in context, so that when you're troubleshooting an issue, you have the data you need in the place that you're working. Having solutions where logs are in one area, traces may be in another, front-end data may be in another system, and then attempting through various plugins and things to try to bring that data into one dashboard adds additional toil to the solution and is not very flexible. Newrelic has removed that toil by automatically showing all your data in context. So your browser data, your infrastructure data, your application data, all of this, your message bus data, database data are all in context with the situation that you're trying to solve for. This is a great way to reduce mean time to detect and mean time to resolution. Let me show you a couple examples of things that Newrelic offers. Currently on the screen right now, you're looking at what we call our browser front end, so what's happening in a user's web browser. Here, I'm focusing on what we call rage clicks. So Newrelic knows when a user's having a bad experience and looks for things like rage clicks. What I can do is I can click on one of these. I can now see the application literally playing out on the screen via our session replay. And I can see issues around what happened with the rage click and found out that saved info is not a function. So here I've found a JavaScript issue in context with what was happening visually with the user experience. As we move from our browser front end, we can look at things like distributed tracing. Distributed tracing allows us to connect what's happening with the front ends versus the back ends. So here I can see transactions that are occurring, select those transactions, click on one of them, and now I can see all of the back-end systems that were interacting with this front-end call. As you can imagine, there are millions of calls that are happening with your clients, but we can basically limit it down to this particular transaction. We can see this transaction is full of errors. But the other part of the in-context experience is not only are we looking at, we were in the front end looking at back-end data, but now we're also looking at logging that was also sent to Newrelic in regards to this particular transaction. We have the ability to look at the log data in context. You can imagine that if you had to go to one tool to look at a trace, grab that trace ID, and then attempt to go find that in your logging solution, the additional time that takes. Here, we serve it in one clear, concise user interface. The other thing we can do here is start to leverage Newrelic's AI capabilities. So here in our AI click here, basically people who are not necessarily up on all of the capabilities of Newrelic can really ask it questions. A lot of the other tools require a high level of knowledge or experts to do them. Now, I'm not saying that you don't have to be an expert here, but I think it's important to understand that you could take a person who's not an expert and just have it start asking it questions. And Newrelic will look at the context in which it is working in, which in this case is the browser front end, attempt to grab this data and then also give you any supporting docs. In this case, we have a query, and I can basically take this query and use it, but it's like, I don't really care about the query, I just want to see the results. No problem. Let me summarize that data for you. And here it gives you the response, the average response time for this application. Now, of course, you can continue to ask it more questions to drill down to that, but using Newrelic AI in conjunction with the in-context experience makes it invaluable to clients. Typically, you would think as New Relic is usually just a troubleshooting tool. It is not that. We are collecting vast arrays of data that makes it more capable to grab information that's going to help the business as well as the technology. So for instance, here we have things like conversion funnels that say, hey, out of 150,000 customers, they select a process, 91,000 of them made it to a cart. And after that, only 37,000 made it to checkout. Now the question is could that be a technical issue? Could that be a visual issue? Could that be a product issue? And that's where we can use the Newrelic data to dive down and understand what's happening. In this case, just by sending a simple thing, the value of the cart to Newrelic, we can understand risk to revenue based on latency or risk to revenue based on errors. So tying business metrics in with performance metrics. This is very powerful. By the way, you can use tagging inside of Newrelic to be able to tie any entity back to a team or an organization. So if we want to look at the ability to bill back and things like that, we have data to support what's happening with what teams using what, how many teams are using these applications and things like that. So a great way to leverage tagging along with that. Now, as we start to look deeper into the Newrelic product here, we're just going to go back here to our front end. I'm going to go look and take a look at those distributed traces we were just looking at. And here I can see we have 3 entities, and I can see that they're all having errors. But this is the front end. These are the back end services. Now I'm switching context, although I'm still working on the same application, from looking from the user experience to now starting to try to understand the experience from the back end. But let's say it's not the application performance itself. Let's say we now want to start looking at infrastructure. So now I'm now switching context again to say, let's go from our front end through APM in this case and look at that infrastructure. Now, along with that, as we mentioned earlier, all of the metrics that are here, we can see these metrics inside of Newrelic to understand how the thing is performing along with the events. And again, as I mentioned earlier, in context, we know these logs are connected to this container. So now I can look at these logs based on this container. Now, can I do more work with logs? Absolutely. Do I always have to work in context? No, I don't. But this is one of Newrelic's real abilities to help you try to reduce that mean time to resolution. Being able to tie all the pieces from the front end all the way in through the back end and the infrastructure, and having the supporting data for that. So there's a couple other areas I'd like to touch on. The first is that, along with various types of data like related to APM, are all the supporting things like databases or message buses. Newrelic supports these technologies out of the box. Again, having one data source to allow you to have access to this data so that now your teams can now all work together as opposed to one team working in one tool, one team working in another tool. Now look, I realized that looking at data, you may want to have other uses. For instance, compliance. For instance, you may want to take this data and start looking at AI of various pieces of data in Newrelic. Not a problem. We do not hold your data hostage. We have the ability to do what we call streaming data exports, which allows you to pull that data out of Newrelic. Obviously, along with that is playing a strong role is security. Now, Newrelic has built into the product the ability to look for things like vulnerabilities. We call the Security RX, and it gives you a sense of what's happening. And again, now I can drill into this. And again, because all the data is in context, not only do I know that I have a particular vulnerability, I know which entities are affected. Now, I'm not trying to replace every security solution out there, but it's important to know that Newrelic is trying to tie that data to as much capability to make your jobs easier. One of the things we're also looking at is the ability to look at what we're doing with AI. Now, I talked a little bit about Gen AI with our Ask Newrelic AI, so you can see we're going down that road. Newrelic has been doing AI monitoring and alerts for years now, so Newrelic has a strong AI pedigree. But as AI technologies are starting to explode, Newrelic now has the ability to monitor your AI and understand the impact of what your solutions are doing. Now, we're not finished there with AI. Obviously, as AI has been gaining popularity, Newrelic has been building what we call AI agentic integrations. What does the word agentic mean? It means to do something on one's behalf. Agentic integrations and ServiceNow, we are now working together to have our AI technologies talk to each other. So if New Relic sees an issue with a server or an application or any entity on the system, we can now let ServiceNow know, and then ServiceNow can query data from us to communicate with each other to do either assisted or unassisted resolution. So an unassisted resolution would be, hey, this server is running 80%, maybe 99% CPU for 2 minutes. That's not good. We tell ServiceNow, service says, oh, yeah, we just need to go restart that service. It goes and does it. You don't even know about it. But we can also have it run in a way where it lets somebody know, hey, whoever's on duty this day, this service has been running at 99%. Do you want me to solve that issue? And then you say yes or no. If you say yes, it then goes and interacts. But at the end of the day, why do you have this technology? You have this technology to communicate either with your internal customers or your external customers. And having the best possible experience for the best possible price is where we're shooting for, right? So we have a thing called PathPoint that allows us to kind of boil down all of that technology into what the business is looking at. So in this case, we're looking at an e-commerce demo, and we can see things that people would normally do: shop, order, notify them when something's happened, and then finally deliver it. And there's a number of services and infrastructure and pieces that are tied to that. We can now surface this to the business to say, hey, our shopping's not looking good right now. What's our revenue at risk? And if you remember, now we can come back here and look at our revenue at risk because we are now collecting that data inside of New Relic. So not only are we an end-to-end solution that allows you to understand the health of it, but we can now tie this to the business metrics of your organization. With this, having a single database of storage of all this information, it's easier to manage, monitor, and frankly, when it comes to doing contracts, if you have to do contracts with 4 vendors, that tends to make things a little more difficult as well. So it's important to understand that having a single vendor that does these kind of things to the degree that you're comfortable with helps reduce toil in your organization, not from only technology, but from a business perspective. Hope you found this interesting. Thank you for your time.